Hi, Phil.
Hello, Mari.
In Tzurba Rabbanon, volume 6, page 105. By the way, everyone, please email me your Hebrew names like Zev ben Shmuel, Mimishpachat Feinblum. That's how they want it. They want your Hebrew name, the son of your father, and and your family name. And we'll send. They want to send certificates to everybody.
Oh wow! I get a certificate.
Yeah.
Ernie, I'm glad I followed the rules.
Hello,
Right.
Hebra.
You did.
Hi,
Hello,
Bernie.
Hello, Bernie.
Bernie, did you speak to Shlomo?
Yeah, he just called me.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a famous topic, the kashrus of gelatin. Another ingredient sometimes found in candies and dairy products that raise potential kashrut questions is gelatin. Gelatin is produced from either the bones or skin of cattle, pigs, and fish. The bones are crushed into a thin powder and then mixed with hot water, which causes hydrolysis to occur and allows the gelatin to be extracted. The extract then congeals after the mixture is cooled. Gelatin that is produced from kosher animals that have been slaughtered properly is kosher, but the majority of gelatin used today comes from non-kosher animals like pigs or cattle that have not been slaughtered properly and therefore have the status of a nevela. It is the halachic status of this type of gelatin that poskim of recent generations have disputed as to whether it may be used or not. One consideration offered to permit using gelatin is based on the Ramah, who rules that one may use the lining of the stomach of a non-kosher animal to make cheese if the lining of the stomach has been totally dried out. Says the Ramah in Yordei Pezayim, or akeva means the inner lining of the stomach. Lefamim mochim otom yavshino, so they can salt it, they dry it out, and v'nasa ke'etz becomes hard like a tree. Umemalino so chalab, they put milk in there, and this is mutar. Dema'achash nisyabesh, because it's dried up, havi ke'etz ba'alma, becomes like a piece of wood. Ve'en bo lachluchis basar, there's no moisture of meat on it, and that the Ramah permitted you to use that. The Shach writes that the same lenient ruling applies to the rest of the stomach, though one should be machmir lechatchila not to use such a substance. Or hakeva lefamim, v'hu adin shar bnei me'ayim, he says the rest of the intestines, kishem yapshimo, so when you dry it, ad shenasu ke'etz. So he adds, he's really, what he's saying is any part of the body of an animal that gets dried out it loses the status of food. He says based on this, we might think that gelatin should be permitted, since it too is dried out when extracted from the bones or skin, is not considered to be edible. Of course, according to the Shach, one should be machmir lechatchila not to use it. One of the first poskim to discuss the issue was Reb Chaim Ozer Grodzinski in his Shalos and Shuvas Achiezer. Remember, Reb Chaim Ozer passed away in 1940. He was the Gadol Hador in Europe. He was the Dayan in Vilna. He was head of the Aguda. And he said even the Shach would agree that gelatin is different from the case in the Ramah, because and therefore says the Achiezer that the Shach would permit lechatchila, because the gelatin has been completely dried out chemically after being extracted from the bones. And the Shach stringencies applies only to the rest of the stomach, which still retains some moisture, but not to the case of bones. Says the Achiezer, B'davar im be'efshar lahachshir min avak chadash. I guess in the type of Reb Chaim Ozer, this gelatin powder was a new food product. So he says, is it permissible to be machshir min avak chadash asher motzo me'atzamot v'shot? It's made from dried out bones. Asher marchim oto b'harbe minei machal. This additive is placed into many foods. Gam mamidim al yado minim shonim, and they stabilize various types of foods. Ulam nira b'oifen zeh shenifsad legamri. The original form of the way it looks has been lost. The gam l'masha kosav hashach. He's referring to the shach we just learned. Duhu adin b'shar b'nei me'ayin, who extended the leniency to other parts of the intestine, kishim yabshimos, so when you dry it up, shenasa ka'etz, it's made like a tree. However, said the shach, v'lachachelein lasos came, near the chol zeh b'nei me'ayin. So Reb Chaim Ozer says the shach was probably machmir there by the intestines, avalo batzomos, but not by bones. Afilu divrei achokim, l'shitas Ramah. He says even those who argued with the Ramah, sham the einat somos malim, that who don't permit bones, mishum desfir le'diesh b'em lachluchis, because they held that even bones had some moisture. Mikol makom nira de'echad in isyavshu, but when they're dried out, ve'ein b'hem od shum lachluchis, and they have no moisture. Heavy atzomos yuveshos, they're dried bones. Everybody would agree that would be permitted. So this was the huge chiddush of Rav Chaim Ozer to permit gelatin. Rav Ovadia Yosef accepted this leniency of the Achiezer based on the Ramah and adds another leniency that relates to the change in form that the gelatin undergoes. Said Rav Ovadia, Minei Yisod Ahet B'zeh, the basis of the leniency is based on Al Divrei Ramah in Yoredei Beizayim, B'Shem Hashibali Aleket, B'Cheinu B'Veis Yosef, B'Lechoy Yesh Lahosif Od Nimuk Lahatir B'Nidon Didan. Rav Ovadia says, let's add another factor to add to the leniency. Hoilu b'talicha totzeret shel gelatin, mina orvat somos, the processing to make gelatin from the skin and from the bones, after they dried out, heitev b'shemesh, when it was dried out in the sun, meshach kama chadoshim, few months, he says, ma'arvim bahem malachim kimiyim, they mix it with chemicals and salt. V'tochnim oto adei ketev, they grind it very finely, until it's a very fine powder. And he uses the phrase ponim chadoshos ba'olakan. This is something new. It's a brand new thing. Cheiniradas Yedidi Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, the Rosh Sefer Tzitz Eliezer, Be'eral Tshuvas Hagoyin Rav Cheskel Abramsky, Umistabech ve'ozel al Tshuvas Achiezer, v'cheinikr laloch l'maisa. So he says so we have Rav Chaim Ozer, you have Rav Ovadia Yosef, and you have the Tzitz Eliezer, who felt that gelatin that was made out of non-kosher bones and skin of animals. Yona, I'm teaching. Other poskim hold, however, that gelatin is forbidden. Rav Cheskel Abramsky, who was the Dayan in London for many years, rejects the suggestion of Rav Ovadia that the form is changed and argues that the gelatin remains the same through the entire extraction process. Dover Borahu, Asher gelatin anase matzomos, gelatin made from bones, any yitzira chadasha. It's not a new form. Shenishtana mechomer el chomer chadash legamri. That it becomes like a new thing. Ayidei and soim kimim, through chemicals. The gelatin uoto chomer atzmo sheyesh no batzomos bikoron. It's basically the same thing that's in the bones. The cholayim soim achimim, the chemicals shemishtamshim behem betasit hagelatin, in making the gelatin, ain't the boy ne'el hafrid. It's to separate. Shar chamorim sheyeshnan batzamos michomer gelatin. It's to do a separation between the bone structures and the gelatin. Shelo yafsidu, so they shouldn't lose it. Or shelo yigru as tivo, and it shouldn't lose the whatever gelatin does. And therefore, Rabbeinu Yonah, who argued with the Ramah, and said that you cannot use bones from a nevela or a treifa. So, although Rav Avramsky then argues that perhaps gelatin should still be permitted for a different consideration, he concludes that it's forbidden for non-halachic reasons. So listen to how the poskim analyze. So Rav Avramsky says it's my opinion to be lenient because bones are not part of the Isser of Nevela Treifa and Tmeya when it comes to the same kind of prohibition. He agrees with Chaim Moser that the bones forbidden according to the Rambam are soft bones, not hard bones. Onan came la halacha lo nira b'zeh Isser. So even though from a halachic ground there doesn't seem to be a prohibition, he says, like, remember, Rav Avramsky is operating like Rav Moshe did in the 50s and 60s. And there was concern that if we are lenient here, those that err and cause others to err, by who say, that based on the whim of the rabbis, the halacha changes. This, of course, is the conservative and reform thing. So they're very concerned about if we matir, the rabbinic authority is going to be weakened. It's just people didn't know exactly how the gelatin is made. Because of lack of knowledge and how it was made, so everyone felt that gelatin was prohibited. Even though those who looked into it understood that it came from bones. He says, if we Orthodox rabbis all of a sudden now agree to permit gelatin, this is going to strengthen the opinions of those in our generation. It'll strengthen those who say, oh, the rabbis decide this they'll permit, this they won't permit. So, very interesting here. Rav Abramsky, even though from a halachic point of view, felt that it was probably reasonable to be lenient, from a meta-halachic view, that he prohibited. Also, the minhag.
So if we see a package, I see a package of food, a chocolate bar, it says gelatin. What do I say? What do I do now?
Okay, Jerry, we are gonna have a conclusion tonight, which will answer your question in terms of that question. So, others include the Minchas Yitzchak, who claim that the majority of poskim have forbidden it on halachic grounds. Let's see the Minchas. Remember, this is the Dayan Weiss. England. He says there was a chemist in England where they produced gelatin, that they make it from pieces of skin. It already had gone through a tanning process that it became shoe leather, mizvadot and like suitcases. From a halachic point, is there a reason to make a difference between gelatin that was produced from leather versus manufacturing the gelatin from bones or skin that had not gone through the tanning process. Where that, he says, the majority of poskim have already said it's osir. He had reviewed some pamphlets regarding making gelatin out of this leather. He said some permitted and some prohibited. They wanted to know my opinion. He felt you should not be matir. What about Rav Moshe Feinstein? Gelatin anasem orot behemot tmeyot uvelot utrefot. Gelatin made from skins. Yesh le'asor. You have to prohibit. The isur ikebo erois matzomis v'chadoyma. There is a prohibition, even though af shepatur, you don't get malchus, like the Rambam says by macholas asuros. Aval pishu osar reze potur. Ulmeiler osar gama gelatin mehem. Rav Moshe says the gelatin would fall under that category of prohibition. Now, Rav Moshe focuses on the question of whether bones and skin have the status of non-kosher meat. And Rav Moshe argues, based on the Rambam, that they do, at least on a Drabanan level. Rav Moshe disagrees with those poskim, such as Rav Chaim Ozer, that hold that the Rambam was referring to soft bones with moisture, but hard bones would be permitted. Rav Moshe holds that the Rambam's stringent ruling would apply to even hard bones as well. So that's a big chilik, and it's an important halachic point that you find in many Tshuvos of Rav Moshe. And this is very famous. Rav Aaron Kotler was a huge machmir on this issue. He didn't get involved very often in halacha, but here he did. He forbade gelatin. And he responds to the argument for leniency offered by Rav Chaim Ozer that the bones are totally dried and are no longer considered edible food. Rav Aaron Kotler explained at length that many sources indicate that if the non-kosher substance is then reconstituted in an edible form, it would be forbidden. He also argues, in addition, that the principle of achshaveh. Achshaveh means I make this important. So if you have an item, but through the concept of achshaveh, achshaveh means this is important. So that if one considers a forbidden but inedible product to be significant, the product is forbidden. So in this case, the gelatin that comes from a non-kosher source has been rendered inedible, but since one mixes it into edible food, you consider it significant. Through achshaveh, you give it significance, and Rav Aaron, based on that, says it would be osir.
Bernie, once it's boiled down, ground down and boiled out, you know that it cannot be reconstituted or grown in any circumstance in a lab or otherwise.
No, it's not grown, but it's used.
He says if it can be reconstituted,
like jello, like with jello, when you put water in it and you cook it, it rehardens and it becomes edible. That's his point.
But it's not a living matter anymore.
No, it's not an issue of living. It's not a matter of living. We don't need it to be living.
Okay.
We don't need it to be living. You're thinking about like cloned meat?
Yes.
That's a different issue. So using cells and then grow. So that's the question: is it meat? Is it fleshik? And is it coat? We're talking like a piece of nevela. It also came from a living thing. So that is also. But so Rav Chaim Ozer said that bones that are very dry, so it doesn't have lachluchis, it's not osir. He held that the Rambam's understanding of bones, that the only time you have to be stringent about bones is soft bones. But hard bones, it's not food anymore. The way Rav Chaim Ozer learned the Rambam. Rav Moshe didn't learn the Rambam that way. He held that when the Rambam talked about bones being poter aval osir, he meant hard bones as well. So there's no leniency, like for Rav Chaim Ozer's leniency goes away if you hold that the Rambam held that hard bones remain prohibited. Now, so in addition, he argues that gelatin should be forgiven regardless because it is like yeast, which is forbidden on Pesach because it causes other foods to rise, so too the gelatin helps to maintain the form of the rest of food in which it's placed. Being a gelatin, regarding gelatin that's made out of skin and bones, katafti in a kuntris barichos zeyoter me'aser shanim, uveredititz tadei shelan dinechleku tamid hachachamim chashuvim. He understood that there were machlokes from Chaim Ozer and Abramsky. Ve'aleiti lesser l'rava shito. He had decided that it should be prohibited. U'lemiktzas posim gankein ein heter bor, and it wasn't clear that they had a permissive ruling. Even though you can't eat the gelatin, that means, like Bernie said, when it's dried up, you can't eat it. But once you put it in the food and it reconstitutes the food and improves the food, so it's like yeast. Yeast is also not edible. You put it in the dough and it makes the dough rise. It's not just about yeast. So that's a very important shul. So now to answer Jerry, Rav Chaim Jachter summarizes 4 basic approaches to gelatin. Number 1, it's always permitted. That's the approach of Rav Ovadia Yosef and Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, right? It was the Posek Hador in Eretz Yisrael up until 1950, mid-50s. Then it is permitted when manufactured from hard bones, and that was the shita of Rav Chaim Ozer and Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin. Right, Rav Henkin was the Posek in America prior to Rav Moshe. After Rav Henkin passed away, I think in 1958, early 1960, is when Rav Moshe became the major posek in America. So you have major poskim that permitted gelatin. Then number 3, it's forbidden because of doubt. Rav Moshe ruled this way because he was uncertain whether reconstituted gelatin was halachically forbidden or not. It says we should note that Rav Moshe discussed this point with regard to whether one may eat foods containing gelatin made from a kosher animal together with dairy. However, concerning non-kosher gelatin, Rav Moshe does not mention this point of uncertainty and states that it's definitely forbidden. Like we mentioned above, that Rav Moshe, when it comes from gelatin, thereby kosher gelatin, the question is it meat? And therefore, is it a problem with basar b'chalav when you mix it with dairy? So there he was mesupik, but he was not mesupik, Rav Moshe, regarding gelatin that was made from non-kosher animals, that he held was usher. And it is forbidden because of certainty, and that we said was Rav Aaron Kotler and Rav Minchas Yitzchak. So Rav Zusha Blech reports that the current practice of most reputable kashrus organizations in the Gola is not to rely on the leniencies for gelatin, and only to accept gelatin made out of fish or gelatin that is certified kosher made from kosher animals. It should be noted that today, the majority of questionable gelatin is made from pig skins rather than from bones. Thus, some of the lenient factors mentioned by the poskim concerning the status of bones may not be applicable. Indeed, the Mishnah says explicitly that the skin of pigs is considered edible and is forbidden. However, other factors such as the change in form and the fact that they are possibly made inedible during the processing would still be relevant. So, the modern story of kosher gelatin production in the United States begins 40 years ago, when a famous chocolate company in the United States wanted to produce kosher marshmallows. The issue of gelatin has always been controversial. So Rav Nachum Tzvi Kornmel, the Rav HaMachshir of the company, posed the shaila to 3 of the prominent halachic authorities in the United States: Rav Moshe Feinstein, Rav Aaron Kotler, and Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin, and to the Gedolim in Eretz Yisrael. Although differing in some of the details in their rulings, the consensus of these authorities was that regular gelatin could not be accepted as kosher, and their position became the normative kosher standard in North America. Indeed, all of the major kosher certifying agencies in the United States adhere to the psakim of Rav Feinstein, Rav Kotler, and Rav Henkin, and do not certify products containing such gelatin. According to the Kosherot organization based in Israel, the current practice of the Israeli Rabbanut is also not to allow non-kosher based gelatin in products marketed in Israel. However, they note that many kashrus organizations outside of Israel may indeed rely on the leniencies in certifying gummy bears, candy bars, and the like. I'm going to read this in English. According to the instructions of the chief rabbinate, use of non-kosher gelatin has been forbidden. Today, the food companies in Israel that use gelatin that is taken from kosher fish, even though fish gelatin is very different in nature from animal gelatin. This appears to be the most updated information according to the policy of the Rabbanut on this issue. In foods with kosher certification from the Gola, it is possible that they use gelatin that comes from non-kosher animals. They rely on the leniency of ponim chadoshos, like we said, a new form. For example, there are gummies in the shape of snakes in which the use of gelatin is very common. When dealing with kosher certification from the diaspora, one should verify what the source of the gelatin is. With reputable kosher organizations in North America, they're not going to give a heter if the gelatin is not kosher. So like Jerry asked, if you see on a product gelatin, it doesn't say kosher gelatin, and it doesn't have certification, you wouldn't be able to eat it, according to the way we are learning tonight. Because it seems like the consensus of the poskim is to adopt the stringency regarding the use of gelatin from a non-kosher animal. Since the chief rabbinate requires the use of gelatin that was extracted from kosher animals that were slaughtered properly, or that comes from fish, one can infer that the majority of poskim did not want to be lenient concerning this ponim chadoshos concept, the new form, and therefore this should be one's practice, and one should not be lenient concerning eating gelatin. Candy bars imported from the diaspora that contain gelatin that comes from non-kosher animals will not receive the approval of the chief rabbinate of Israel. In addition to being used in some kinds of food, gelatin is also used in medicine. Pills are often placed in a capsule made of gelatin to be swallowed. The Sefer HaKashrus notes that gelatin swallowed as part of a capsule is also subject to dispute among the poskim and should be forbidden, though there is room for leniency in case of need. Capsula asuya mi gelatin. If you have a capsule made of gelatin with and inside of it is medicine, yesha kosav, that av shemasim shbechol yom shebolim trufoselo, even though we see people swallowing this every day, afilu cholim shein b'hem sakana mikol makom mikra din osher levoilo. Mikra din, you shouldn't swallow them. Achein b'shas hatzorech, if there's a great need, because let's say there's no alternative medicine, yesh al mi lismoch ala matir levon, to swallow it. On the other hand, Rav Jafter cites Rav Henkin, Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, and Rav Hershel Schachter, who cites Rav Soloveitchik, all of whom that ruled that it was permissible to take medicine in a gel cap. Therefore, Rav Yosef Eliyahu Henkin writes, it is common practice to ingest medicine wrapped in gelatin capsules. It appears that what is relied on is the evaporation of the gelatin during its production, rendering it inedible, and the fact that one does not intend to consume the gel caps as food. Rav Jafter elaborates in the article how many of the other considerations for being machmor for gelatin used in food may not be relevant to gelatin used in medicine, including Rav Kotler's concern for achshaveh, since most poskim hold that achshaveh does not apply to medicine, so it's not part of an edible substance. Rav Hershel Schachter, Rosh Kollel of Yeshiva University, informed this author that Rav Yosef Ber Soloveitchik told him that it is permissible to ingest a gelatin-coated medicine tablet. The Tzitz Eliezer ruled permissively. Rav Schachter also believed that even one wishes to take medicine for relief or even minor pain, michush ba'alma, is permitted to ingest a gel cap. Of course, if one has an alternative, he should avoid the gel cap in favor of medicine that does not contain non-kosher ingredients. One should make a reasonable effort to seek such an alternative. The Ramah says that as well. So in addition to the leniencies concerning gelatin, all of the leniencies discussed at the beginning of the shiur concerning taking non-kosher medicine in general would also apply. For this reason, there's good reason to rule leniently when medicine that is kosher is not available. Okay. Any comments, questions,
Yes.
points of order?
Ernie, from a practical point of view, you know how difficult it is for the patients to be compliant with taking medications. Now, on top of that, you're going to add the chumrah of asking an individual lay person to go find out if there is a suitable alternative that's kosher. I understand for Pesach, I understand the chumrah, but on a practical basis, that's nearly an impossibility with all these medications.
We also remember, Bernie, we learned last week that you could take a piece of tissue. Everyone had, like, you could wrap the gel cap in a piece of paper tissue and swallow it that way.
Yuck.
You know, we discussed also the fact that the reason it's made as a gel cap is because it's easier to swallow than a tablet.
That's correct. So there's no question. We saw many leniencies stated that if you can't find an alternative, and for many of these things you can't find an alternative. Now, if there's an easy alternative, there are many kosher patients who are machmir about kashrus that would look for an alternative. But let's say there's a standard prescription and there's no alternative. I don't think there's any problem, particularly if you're a chola, even a chola she'ein bo sakana. Here, where they're talking about mechush ba'alma. Mechush ba'alma means a headache. Means you're not even considered a chola she'ein bo sakana. And yet Rav Schachter said Rav Soloveitchik allowed it.
So just
So I think there's plenty of leniency regarding that.
Sorry, Ernie. Just from a practical point of view, we know for Pesach there is an established booklet that gets sent around with all of what is kosher, what is chametz, what is not chametz, what can be used.
Yes.
Is there any such bulletin or journal available for the frum consuming public on medications in general?
Yeah, Rabbi Bess sends that out every year. He has a compendium every year. You can get it from the kollel. I believe the kollel puts it out, or Rabbi Bess Shul used to put that out. Absolutely.
Yeah, but that's primarily for Pesach, not
no. He had
year-round.
one. He had one all Chaim. Aren't I Chaim? Didn't he have one? He had one regular for medicines, right?
I don't recall.
I've seen that in a while. I mean, I believe the Star K or the CRC might have that. I haven't seen the Colo general medication one. The one for Pesach is the one I've seen every year.
Yeah. Okay, but I think there's one. First of all, the one that's Pesach, that also tells you which types of medicine are kosher in general. Because there's a listing, ampicillin and whatever. Yeah. So that gives you an idea. It's not just chametz. It also tells you which ones are kosher.
Generally speaking,
most capsules have gelatin. Most capsule medication have gelatin, or no?
So if it's a soft capsule, usually that's made out of gelatin.
It can be out of vegetable gelatin also.
It can be but we wouldn't know.
It'll say vegetable gelatin.
Oh, okay. Anyways, I think
related to this topic, the question of cost is also, sometimes you can find a medication that they let's say the cost is $20 for 100, and the kosher version is $50 for 100. So is there a price point at which we say, it's okay to be lenient, or do we say no, you have, no matter what if it's available, even the price is that much higher, or is there a price point at which we draw a line?
I don't think there's a price. It's the same thing with kosher food. I mean, right? Kosher meat.
No, it's not. You can't compare kosher food. That's like Isser and Heter. Here we're talking about a situation where we have a suffix over here, and we're talking about something.
You certainly, by the way, Chaim, you can see we certainly have major posting that you can rely on for Heter gelatin, even made from non-kosher bones and skin. We learned that tonight. So I agree with you. You have yesh lis. That's why he said yesh lismoch, yesh al mi lismoch hamatirin lebolam. He didn't have any problem. This is they're writing this for those that want to be machmir on themselves, but there's no reason to be. There's no reason to be. Based on the way we're learning tonight, I think you have plenty of people to be soymech on, especially when it comes to medicine. When it comes to candy and this and that, you want to, there are people who are soymech on the materium as well, but it looks like the standard when it came to food in America came not to rely on the heter of Chaim Ozer. When it comes to medicine, I don't think doesn't seem to be an issue if it's more expensive, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's basically the way we learned tonight. I mean, they said it very clearly. So what's all? So shasat sorech is also a financial issue technically, but I think it's important. This is probably one of the most famous machlokas achronim in the last 50 years. You know, where you can see who got involved, Rav Aaron Kotler, Rav Moshe, and it was a major debate here. So finally, you know, we have a very good understanding where it comes from, the Ramah, the Shach, and I think it's of great value. Now, normally we don't read these together, but today I'm going to read this issue about kosher whiskey on page 170. That's because this group drinks a lot of whiskey, and I think it's something that's close to our heart, and I think we should go through this. And because since it involves some
into your heart,
it involves some difficult halachic analysis, I think we can go through it and analyze together.
And Ernie, before we go on that, what in this case also gelatin? There's an issue with gelatin in medicine, but what about gelatin and vitamins? Well, vitamins is not considered medically necessary, but some may view it as medically helpful. A little bit different than necessary.
Right. So you want to say that would be more in the food area. But again, when you swallow a vitamin, you're not eating it as a food. Right. You know, like he said. Remember, we read that it's not being looked at like as a food, and it's a medicine. So it may fall under the same leniency as other medicines, I would say. Okay, so we're on page 117. It's been a long time since the McVeigh family took Abu Musar Jabur ibn Hayyan's secretive distillation and converted them into the first bottles of whiskey some 1,200 years ago. Originally used as an internal anesthetic and an external antibiotic, whiskey from the Gaelic usage, meaning water of life, has become the most popular liquor in the world. It says in the footnote, whiskey annual sales are worth approximately $17 billion. Vodka next on the list is $10 billion. Such popularity could not be free of controversy. Ireland and Scotland both claim to have given birth to whiskey. Food expert Kate Hopkins calls it a teku and leaves the matter unresolved since no country can bring definitive proof. The whiskey ring, a bribing scheme involving hundreds of whiskey distillers and government officials, was among the muddiest chapters of 19th century American politics. There's even a machlokas concerning the proper spelling of the word. The Scots spell it whiskey without an E, and the Irish spell it whiskey with an E. For us Torah Jews, the controversy has a different name, sherry casks. The process of making whiskey is quite straightforward. The grains are crushed, water is added, the mixture is boiled, yeast is added for fermentation. By now, we basically have beer. Then it is distilled and aged in wooden barrels. Although easier said than done, that part poses no halachic problems, except for the last stage, the aging in the barrels. In his booklet, Rabbi Akiva Niehaus suggests that whiskey was originally aged in any barrel, preferably a used one, so the sharp tannins found in the wood would not ruin the delicate flavor of the scotch. Sherry wine casks were abundantly available simply because Spanish producers would send their wine in barrels to England to be bottled. This continued until the 1970s, when sherry producers began bottling their wine in casks were no longer found in abundance in the UK. So whiskey producers bought American bourbon casks instead. But consumers were not happy. Something in their drink did not taste the same. Now they had to go out of their way to get those old sherry casks, going as far as filling new barrels with sherry just to mature the whiskey later on. This, of course, presents a complex halachic question. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah explains that any wine owned or produced by non-Jews may not be consumed by rabbinic law because it may lead to intermarriage and eventually idolatry. We went through a lot of the halachas of Yain Nesach as a group together. Some sources identify this decree dating back to the time of the Jewish people in the desert when Pinchas, following the shameful affair with the daughters of Midian, forbade any consumption of non-Jewish wine. Sherry wine, a pungent variety from the Spanish region of Jerez, is considered stam yenam and is therefore forbidden by halacha. What is the status of other drinks mixed with it? Must they have bittul? And if so, at what ratio? The Gemara relates an incident where Ravina allowed his son, Rav Chia, to store beer in a barrel previously used for non-kosher wine. That Gemara is in Avodah Zarah 33b. Accordingly, the Shulchan Aruch codified that vessels prohibited by non-Jewish wine may be used for storing water, beer, and other liquids in them, as long as they were rinsed beforehand. That's in your Day 137. The reason for that, explains the Taz, is because the flavor of wine ruins the other liquids. We're familiar with this concept, nois and tam livgam. It gives a bad taste. Therefore, even if the liquids were stored for more than 24 hours in the barrel, the time needed for a liquid to absorb the flavors contained in the walls of a utensil, they may still be consumed. If so, why is there even a question regarding whiskey? Is not whiskey among the other liquids permitted by the Shulchan Aruch? Clearly not. Whiskey distillers make a big fuss about the sherry cask aging. They even take on extra expenses to do so, and consumers are willing to pay the added price for the enhanced flavor. Connoisseurs seem to agree that sherry whiskey is superior to regularly aged whiskey, although there's little consensus on how this is achieved. It's clearly not just the wine. Otherwise, wouldn't it be easier and cheaper to just add a small proportion of wine into the whiskey? In any event, halachic authorities understand that you can't rely on nos and tam livgam leniency when the mixture is enhanced. It means nos and tam livgam means it's got to give a bad taste. Well, if people are buying the whiskey because it's got a good taste, you can't use the heter of nos and tam livgam. And this is expressed clearly by the Magen Avram in his discussion on some laws of Pesach. That's in Orach Chaim 451. Similarly, we cannot rely on the fact that wine absorbed in the casks is most certainly not ben yomo, right? Any absorbed taste in a vessel will only enhance the flavor of the food cooked in it for 24 hours. That is, as long as it is ben yomo. After that, any given taste is considered pogum, ruined, and no longer permits the food. You can't say that it's certainly not ben yomo, right? When the whiskey is poured, since as the Rav explains, wine does not become pogum even after 24 hours. In fact, says the Shach, instead of getting ruined, the flavor of wine actually improves with time. So you can't rely on this leniency either. Therefore, the question is, can the good taste of the wine imparted into the whiskey be mevatel? Can it be nullified? After all, there's a rabbinic prohibition to annul forbidden mixtures lechatchila. Gentlemen, when we talk about bittul, we talk about accidentally a piece of chazer fell into the cholent and got dissolved there. So we measure if there's 1 in 60, 60 to 1, and you can't find the chazer melted, you can't remove it, the whole mixture is permitted. But that's only if it happened to fall in there. You can't, I'm going to put a piece of chazer in there, and then of course I'll be mavatal it. You can't mavatal isur lechatchila. Whether it's doraisa, whether it's derabana. Ein mavatal isur lechatchila. So there's a rabbinic prohibition to annul forbidden mixtures lechatchila. The Shulchan Aruch states that if a person does so b'mezid, the food becomes forbidden to him and to the person for whom the nullification was intended. Even more so, Rabbi Kiva Eger quotes opinions that hold that even when a seller nullifies the forbidden taste for unknown customers, it is prohibited to them. However, poskim were lenient when the nullification was made for a majority of non-Jewish consumers, as is the case of any whiskey distillery. So being mevatel lechatchila is permitted if the primary consumers are non-Jewish. There's an Igros Moshe Yoredeya that discusses that. If so, what is the amount of wine that must be annulled and at what ratio? There's a dispute among the poskim how much wine is absorbed into the cask. In Siman 135, the Shulchan Aruch states that a vessel filled with forbidden wine absorbs only kedei klipa, a thin layer, and therefore may be kashered by peeling that layer. The Taz assumes that this is the halacha, even if the wine was in the vessel for a long period of time. However, the Shach is of the opinion that kvisha means you soak a liquid in a vessel for 24 hours, is just like cooking, and therefore gives off its taste to the whole vessel, not just kedei klipa, but the whole internal walls of the barrel. Now, since it's impossible to know how much taste is actually absorbed, the halacha assumes the worst case scenario, meaning that the entire vessel is filled with the taste. Therefore, does not seem to be clear-cut agreement on who to follow. There does not seem to be clear-cut agreement on who to follow. And some later poskim side with the Taz, which would be a leniency, because you could be mavatel kedei klipa, while others hold like the Shach. Now, regarding the ratio required to annul the absorbed wine, the Tur quotes a dispute among the Rishonim. Some of them assume that it is like any other forbidden taste, which requires 60 times the volume of permitted food to become nullified, while a second opinion suggests it may be annulled in just 6 times its volume. The source of the lenient opinion is the understanding of the Ravid and the Ri of Rav Yochanan ruling in the Gemara of Zorah that if one had 2 cups of wine, one chulin and one of truma, and he diluted them with water and mixed them together, one should consider the permitted chulin wine as non-existent, and the truma wine is then nullified by the water. Since the Gemara does not specify the size of the cups, nor the amount of water added, the Ravid and the Ri assume they are 2 equally sized cups, diluted by 3 parts of water each, because they didn't drink wine without dilution. So the wine dilution standard was 1 part wine, 3 parts water. That's what the Gemara means here. So given the halacha of considering the permitted non-sacred wine as non-existent in matters of nullification, it can be inferred that there is a 1 part of wine against 6 of water, and the Shulchan Aruch follows this lenient opinion. That's in Yoredei 134. Now, why is wine different from any other beverage that should be annulled in just 6 parts as opposed to 60? The Rashba explains that when mixed with 6 parts of water, it can no longer be considered wine. Rather, it becomes an acid beverage called kihua, which imparts a ruined flavor. Now, it's not clear, though, whether this ratio of nullifying wine in a mixture of 1 to 6 is something particular to wine mixed with water, according to these opinions, or would apply as well to wine mixed with other liquids. Once again, there's a machlokas between the Taz and the Shach. In Siman 114, the Ramah prohibits buying beverages from non-Jews when it may be assumed that wine was mixed into them in a ratio of more than 1 in 60. The Shach consequently infers that wine can only be nullified in water in a ratio of 1 to 6, but in other liquids you need 1 to 60. The Taz believes that they're all simply quoting the source of the ruling, which was the Mordechai, but the Ramah himself requires only a ratio of 1 to 6. So you see there's a machlokas Taz and Shach. The Taz is lenient, the Shach is machmir. Later poskim seem to agree with the Taz and suggest that the wine in the casks, even if it does impart taste, is considered this damaged wine kichua. And this seems to be an integral part of the argument of Moshe Feinstein, Rav Yitzchak Weiss, to permit whiskey. This is Igrit Moshe Yoredei 162 and the Minchas Yitzchak 228. There, Rav Moshe was dealing where wine was actually added to liquor, but the same arguments apply. Accordingly, we can assume that the flavor of the wine could be annulled in the casks if we can ascertain that there's a 6-to-1 ratio present between the whiskey and the taste that's been absorbed in the barrels. Everybody with me so far? Yes. Another potential issue concerning sherry casks is the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch that imposes a limit to nullifications on ingredients specifically intended to give flavor, avida l'taima, as long as their taste is perceived. This issue, however, can be deflected either by arguing that once it becomes kichua, it no longer enhances the taste because it's not wine, or by saying that even whiskey producers are not really interested in the flavor of wine, even when the labels clearly say they do. Rav Weiss suggests that the main purpose of adding the wine is reducing the negative impact of the wood on the liquor. Here too, it seems obvious that even when the sherry affects the whiskey, it does so in an indirect manner, which could not be accomplished by just adding wine. Consequently, our main question remains, are there 6 parts of whiskey against the amount of absorbed wine? Rav Niehaus estimates a ratio of 3.7 to 1 if we consider the whole volume of a standard wooden sherry cask. Although he does not address this point, it is obvious there's much more than 6 to 1 if we are to follow the opinion mentioned above of the Taz, that considers only a klipa of the cask. Now, besides the issues mentioned here, many other issues that are beyond the scope of this article must be considered regarding the halachic status of whiskey. How many times was the cask filled with whiskey? What about casks that mix sherry and bourbon? What is the halacha for blended whiskeys that were only partly matured in sherry casks? When can a person rely on the information given by the distillery? The safest thing to do in these types of cases is to acquire only supervised products unless a recognized halachic authority permits otherwise. But I think we got a very nice overview of what the issues are and how the poskim deal with it. Any comments, questions, or ha'arot?
Ernie, I cannot understand how the calculation of 3.7 to 1 whiskey to the sherry in the wood. I thought the amount of sherry in the wood is what's left over from the barrel that was previously used for wine. I would assume that wood has dried before they put whiskey in it.
No,
The
Bernie,
rate has to be much larger.
Bernie. So
Yeah, please explain.
I'm going to explain. There are some isurim. For example, you take a hot piece of meat and you bring something. If the meat is not fatty, and you bring a non-kosher piece next to it and it touches it, so the prohibited isur only enters into that piece of meat kedei klipa. Kedei klipa means you have to peel off just the place where they touched. Now, if the piece of meat was fatty, so then the isur, if a piece of nevela touches a piece of meat, the isur spreads to the whole steak. So if you have a 10-ounce steak, and if it's kedei klipa, the amount is minuscule. So versus if it's 10 ounces. So if it's 10 ounces, you need 600 ounces of kosher meat to be mavatel the steak. On the other end, if it's only kedei klipa, you only need, probably 10 other steaks to be mavatel the klipa. So the same thing. The machlokas between the Shach and the Taz held that when you put sherry wine into a barrel and the barrel absorbs it, so how much isser has been absorbed? So the Taz says only a klipa, only the amount within 1 millimeter. So of a barrel, so there you clearly would have enough. But according to the Shach, the whole wooden barrel absorbs it. So you have to calculate the volume of that wooden barrel. You use Archimedes principle. You put the barrel, minus the air in the barrel. You understand? You open the barrel. Let's say you see through displacement. We have these shilas and kashras. If you have a vessel, if the whole vessel is absorbed in the isser, you got to measure. So that's what we said. If you have a very wide pan and very shallow, sometimes you'll have 60 against it. But in our regular pots, if the whole pot absorbed the isser, you'll never have 60 to 1 if you have water in your pot. So that's what he's going on, Niehaus. They've measured the volume of a barrel, and they know how much volume of whiskey goes into that barrel, and the ratio is only 3.7 to 1. Where's Bernie? Oh, there's Bernie. So that's, yeah, you see the enough community. That's why, according to Taz, no problem. You certainly would have enough to nullify. But according to the Shach, you don't.
All right.
But the fact that there's no actual wine, it's just like a coating or something. Is that would make a difference?
No, it's not a coating. It's the flavor of the sherry wine that's been absorbed in the wooden barrel, and
Right.
they actually want that flavor. So it's not a coating; it's a flavor, and it's not livgam. So, anyways, I think it's very well written, and I think it really goes through the issues regarding but many whiskeys are sold and they're not matured in sherry.
Yeah, but Ernie isn't part of the flavor, the wood, the oak as well.
The oak is fine. There's nothing trafe about oak.
I know, but so how do they determine what part of the flavor is sherry, what part is the oak? I mean, it must be. Is there a scientific way to figure it out?
No, Harold. If you have an oaked cask and that absorbed sherry, so the sherry wine, so the Shach holds that you have to assume that the whole barrel has absorbed sherry wine. So, but like you said, if it's an oak cask, there's nothing wrong with that. If it's been, by the way, there's a list that is also produced that shows you the whiskeys that are considered to be kosher. The OU puts out a list, and I think most of the whiskeys we see are not in sherry casks. Am I wrong?
They're in bourbon casks.
No, there's a large number is also in sherry cask. But now there is a lot of the ashkochas actually put on the whiskey themselves, like the London
London based
has on some ones, and the OU has on some.
Remember, bourbon is made out of grain. So bourbon, there's no trafus in bourbon. There's no yayin nesech stam yainam with bourbon. So the bourbon, unless the bourbon's been made in a sherry cask, but then you probably have. Anyways, there's nothing wrong with bourbon flavor. Okay. So very good. Next week we will start with mitzvahs chinuch, and tonight we'll do the daf yomi.